Remember when? How many stories have started with those two words? Remember when? You know, remember when we took that long road trip and we drove across country? Remember when we first met? Remember when I lost my wallet or my keys? Remember when we won the championship? Remember when you fell and rolled down the hill? Well, that was me. Remember when I fell and rolled down the hill? Remember when? These are actually powerful words. Remember when? When they're spoken to someone who was there, who experienced what you're talking about, who saw it, who knows exactly what you're referring to when you say, remember when. When you say this, the images come flooding back. The sights, the sounds, even the emotions can come back when you say, remember when. I can say to my family, remember when we went on vacation to Galena? And when I say that, all of us, we know exactly what I'm talking about. And you get this feeling of relaxation. Because this was a much needed trip that we took. It was a very laid back and relaxing trip that we took in the time when we were very busy. And it was a very stressful time in our lives. But all those thoughts, the feelings, the emotions come back when you say, remember when? And this is why so many people just love to reminisce. Well, today we're going to talk about remembering. The funny thing is just a couple months ago, when we were studying Philippians, we read to forget what lays behind and press on to what's before you. So forget what happened in the past and look to the future. Continue to strive to be like Jesus. But see, the point in that passage was don't get wrapped up in the past so that you live in the past. Whether it's wrapped up in good things that happened in the past or wrapped up in failures or sins in the past, to where you say, where you take your eyes off of where you're headed and you no longer follow Jesus. Or you say, I can't because I failed. Or we say, remember when I used to do this so great? It's not like that anymore. But don't get so wrapped up and caught up in the past that you no longer strive to be like Jesus, that you no longer strive for the calling that God has given you. But today, as we look at this passage, we're going to see that there are actually some good things about remembering the past. And we're talking especially here about the things that God has done in the past. So we're talking about not living in the past, or not getting stuck in the past, but remembering as a motivation for moving forward. As a motivation for living for Christ now and being faithful now in the present. Well, the passage we're looking at today, it's actually a long passage, but there's actually 3 events that take place in this passage. And these 3 events all take place as Israel is on their way into the promised land. But in all 3 of these events, we see remembering or taking note of things that were done in the past, and then people acting upon those things in the present. And so we're going to get into Joshua now and see what kind of things we should remember or take note of and how it will affect our actions in the present. So beginning in chapter 1, verse 10. Joshua chapter 1, verse 10. It says, and Joshua commanded the officers of the people, pass through in the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you are to pass over this Jordan to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving to you to possess. And to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. Your wives, your little ones, and your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the men of valor among you shall pass over armed before your brothers and shall help them, until the Lord gives rest to your brothers and as he has to you, and they also take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession and shall possess it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan towards the sunrise. And so here we have this. Last week we saw that God told Joshua to take Moses' place as the leader of Israel. And he told Joshua then to lead the people into the promised land. So right away we see here that Joshua now does it. He does what God has told them. He goes right away to tell the people, get ready to go. And he says to them to prepare provisions. In other words, they need to get their food together, and they need to gather together whatever they need for their family and for their animals, and be ready to go, because they're setting out to the promised land soon. But then he turns and he directly addresses these the 2.5 tribes who were staying there on the east side of the Jordan. They were settling in the land east of the Jordan. And you'll remember from our study in Numbers that when Israel came to this point and they were about getting ready to go into the land, that there were people in the land, the Moabites and the Midianites, who opposed Israel. And they came and they fought against Israel. And Israel conquered them with God's help. And they took that land. And the people of these 2.5 tribes said to Moses, you know what, this is really good pasture land, and we have lots of animals that could use this. Can we settle here in this land? And if you remember, when Moses first heard it, he wasn't very happy with it, because he thought, what are you doing? He was upset with them because he thought they were trying to get out of helping the rest of Israel take the land that God had promised. He thought that they were being unfaithful to God and rejecting His promise, just like the Israelites had done years before they wandered in the wilderness. And he thought that maybe that if they did this, that they would discourage the rest of the people from going in and taking the land, because they knew it was a big task in front of them. And so he was upset that they were going to do this and discourage the rest of the people. But these 2.5 tribes, they promised Moses and said, no, we will go and fight with the rest of Israel. So we will go in with you and help you take the land. And when they made that promise, Moses said, okay. But he commanded him and said, but you better do what you've just promised. Well, now we get to Joshua, and Joshua goes through those 2 tribes, and he's basically saying, remember your commitment? You made a commitment. You need to keep your commitment. Because we know when he says, remember what was commanded and remember what you committed, it doesn't just simply mean, oh, think about it. But it means to fulfill your commitment, to keep your commitment, to follow through with what you have said. Well, look at the people's response in verse 16. It says, and they answered Joshua, all that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. Their response is very good and very enthusiastic. They remember their commitment and they are ready to fulfill it. And in fact, they are so ready to fulfill their commitment that they pledge complete and wholehearted obedience to Joshua. Whatever he tells us to do, we'll do it. Wherever you lead us, we'll go. And they declare that anyone who doesn't obey Joshua will be put to death. That's how ready they are to keep their commitment. We will do it. But of course, when they say this, they make one clarification. In verse 17, they say, only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Now you read that and it sounds like a blessing or a prayer, and I think on one hand it is. It seems to suggest that they are saying, may God be with you. But it also seems to be saying, we will follow you as long as God is with you. As long as there is evidence that God is leading you, then we will follow you just like we followed Moses. And they encourage him in the end, saying, be strong and courageous. In other words, let's go. Lead us. The thing is that when they tell Moses, or tell Joshua this, they're making a big commitment. Because what they're doing is they are leaving their families in the land east of the Jordan, and they are crossing over with the rest of Israel to go to battle. They're leaving their families at home and risking their lives, and there's even the possibility of not returning as they go into battle with the rest of their brothers. The thing is that some of you in here have experienced that kind of commitment. You have experienced that same kind of feelings, those same situations, and you know it's a big commitment. But here these people are, and they're making this commitment, and they're going, and they keep this commitment wholeheartedly. We said we'd do it, we're going to do it. And I think this is a good example for us today. Because I think there's a sad thing that has happened in our culture. It has become so easy for people to break their commitments. In fact, it's so easy for people to break commitments that we're not even surprised when it happens anymore. We may be disappointed, but we're not surprised. It's so easy because people will, whether you're talking about big commitments or small commitments. Big commitments like marriage vows. I promise to love and cherish you for the rest of your life. Well, not anymore. It's so easy for people to break our commitments. Or little things, even simple things like, I'll be there. How many times do we say, I'll be there, and then don't come? It happens. It's not even surprising. Maybe disappointing, but it's not surprising. It's too easy to break commitments in this culture of ours. The thing is I don't think any of us would go and say, I'll be there. I don't really mean it. We're not lying when we say, I'll be there. But then when we don't come and we don't follow through on even our small commitments, it's the same kind of lack of integrity as if you had lied. Because you're breaking your word. As believers in Jesus Christ, as followers of Jesus Christ, as the people of God, we need to keep our commitments, whether big or small. We need to keep our commitments because a person of integrity keeps their commitments. So the 2.5 tribes, they agree to go with the rest of Israel into battle. But before they all leave, Joshua decides to do a little reconnaissance. So look at verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, and Joshua son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, go view the land, especially Jericho. And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. Now, if you've read ahead or you know the story of how Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, then you know that Joshua didn't have to do a whole lot. At least not at the beginning. God did it, right? I mean, Joshua went and, well, we'll get there. But you may be wondering, why did he send spies? I mean, God's going to do all the hard work, right? But the thing is, you have to remember, Joshua doesn't know that yet. God hasn't told Joshua what's going to happen. And Joshua is actually being a very good, wise leader and trying to gather as much information as he can before he takes his people into battle. And so he sends these spies into the land to check things out. But as we read this, you may also wonder, why did the spies go into the house of a prostitute? And you may first read that and say, that sounds very wrong. But I would say the spies, I don't believe they went there for any wrong reasons. They didn't go there to visit the prostitute. They went there for a very practical reason. It was a place where people came in and out. It was a place where strangers may even come in and stop. And it was a place where they thought they might be able to go and be unnoticed. They were spies, and so they didn't want to be noticed. So they go in to the house of a prostitute, a place to stay where they think they might be unnoticed. Well, let me just tell you the story here from here on out, or a big part of it here. They thought maybe they'd be unnoticed, but somehow, someone figured out who they were and went and told the king. Now, how did they figure out? I don't know. But we do know from some of the verses that we'll read and you'll see later, is that the people knew about Israel and they were afraid of them. So somehow, maybe they knew the promise that Israel had been told, you're going to have this land. And they knew what Israel had done on the way to the land, and they knew what was coming their way. And maybe they saw these men and figured out that they were Israelites. Or maybe they saw these men and just knew that they were strangers and they weren't anyone they recognized, and just put it all together and assumed that they were Israelites, and then went and told the king. Some men from Israel have come to spy out the land. And so they go and they tell the king. And the thing is, the king hears it and he takes this as a real threat. And he immediately goes to Rahab's house and starts talking to her. Now Rahab, in the meanwhile, she took the spies, these two men from Israel, and she hid them on her roof. This is a normal, people used to hang out on their roofs, and so she hid them on the roof underneath the flax, basically the plants that they had cut down, and it'd be kind of like stalks of wheat or something like that. But she hid them there, and then she really quickly devises a story to throw the king and his men off the trail. And she says, oh, they came in, but they left. And you should go chase after them now. And so they do. They take off and they start chasing after the men. Well, then she goes up and she talks to these men on the roof. But here's the thing about what Rahab is doing right here. She is risking her life. Do you ever think about that? This is the king of her people talking to her, saying, where are those men who came in to spy on us? Where are those men who want to attack us? And she's basically saying, oh, they're not here. She's risking her life to protect these men. Why would she do that? These strangers, these people who she knows these people are wanting to come in and take the land. Why would she risk her life? Well, it's because she had heard about God. And she believes that the Israelites will conquer Jericho and the rest of the land. And she wants to strike a deal with them. She's actually saying, I know we're in trouble, and I know a way to save myself. And so she wants to strike a deal. She believes that God will give them the land, and she wants to strike a deal with them. So she does. She says, tell you what, I'll hide you here, and because I helped you, you helped me. And so I want you to save me and my family when you guys come and take the city. And the spies agree, but they give her 3 conditions. And they said these 3 conditions have to be met. 1, you need to tie a red cord in your window. 2, you need to have everyone in your house, that all of your family members in your house. If they wander out of the house, they're on their own. And 3rd, you need to keep this a complete secret. So don't tell anyone. Well, she agrees to it, and she lets them out of the window of her house. Her house just happened to be on the wall. And she lets them out the window down and tells them, you go hide in the hills for a few days till the men who are looking for you come back, and then go. So they do. They go and they hide in the hills, and then they go to Joshua and they tell Joshua everything. And look what they say to Joshua in verse 24 of chapter 2. It says, and they said to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. Now this is a very different report than what was brought back to Moses by the 10 spies who spied out the land earlier. Remember, they came back and said, it's great land, but we can't do it. These spies come in and they say, hey, it's ours. And everyone's afraid of us. They know we're coming. We can take it. Now, I think they're responding this way in faith to God, but I also think that Rahab's words may have formed part of their conclusion. And I want to read those words for you here in just a second. But first, let me just mention a thing. You know, in our English Bibles, you see the word in Lord in all caps, L-O-R-D in all caps. And that represents the name Yahweh of God, the name of God, the personal name of God. And as we read this, I'm going to actually use the name Yahweh because I think it helps us to understand what Rahab is saying a little bit better. Because I think sometimes when we just use the title Lord, it kind of hides the distinctiveness of what she's trying to say. Because what she's saying is, Yahweh, your God, as opposed to any other God. And so let's read this together. She's talking about God, Israel's God, by name, starting in verse 8 of chapter 2. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen upon us, that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard of it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For Yahweh, your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. I think this is the key part of the story of Rahab. Her statement's right here. She believed in Yahweh, the true God. Now here's the interesting thing about Rahab. She didn't know much about God. She didn't know His law. She really knew very little about Him at all. She knew what He had done for the people of Israel. And she believed that He was the true God, the most God. She knew that He was God, and she says, in heaven and on earth. You know what that means? Everywhere. In heaven and on earth. Everywhere in between. He is God everywhere. And meaning that He is the great God. He is the highest God over all things and over all people. You see, she didn't know much about God, but what she did know about God pointed her to this truth, that He is God. What she knew, what she had seen, was evidence that He was the true God. I think this is a lot like what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, when he says that there is evidence around us. We can look at creation and we can look at His works, at the things He does, and know that He is. Know that He exists. Know that He is the true God. And I think it's very similar. Her response here is that she is looking at what she knows and what she's seen and saying, He must be God of heaven and of earth. So Rahab took notice of the evidence, and she responded in faith. In fact, if we were to look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, there is Rahab's name. In the middle of all the names of heroes of the faith, we read about Rahab, who helped the slaves and was saved because of it. She acted in faith. And then we can look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. And we find out that Rahab is an ancestor of King David and ultimately of Jesus. So we have a woman who has a very questionable background, who has become a very significant figure in history. That is God's grace. You see, we see that here, that God gives grace. And it doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. If you respond in faith, He will save you and He will make you His own. I want to turn and look at some words of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 21, He is not speaking about Rahab, but it is very fitting to this situation. So Matthew, the very first book of the New Testament, chapter 21, beginning in verse 28. Jesus is telling a parable. And He says, speaking to the Pharisees, and He says this, "What do you think? A man had 2 sons. And he went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work in the vineyard today.' And he answered, 'I will not.' But afterward he changed his mind and went." So he goes to the first son and he says, go work in the vineyard. And he says, "I'm not going to do that." He kind of responded with, "I don't want to do that." But then after he thought about it, he said, you know what? That was the wrong answer. I'm going to honor my father, and I'm going to go do what he said. I'm going to work in the vineyard. Okay? So then, verse 30. And he went to the other son and said to him the same. So he said the same thing, and he answered, I go, sir. But he did not go. So the second one gives him lip service and says, oh yeah, I'm going to do it. But then he doesn't do it. He doesn't honor his father. He doesn't care. He just does it. He just said yes to get him off his back, I think. Verse 31, Jesus asks the question, which of the two did the will of his father? They said, the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even when you saw it, you did not afterward change your mind and believe in him. What Jesus is saying is there are sinful people who are not doing the right thing. But when they heard the truth, they responded to it in faith. Just like that kid who said, no, I won't go. But then he said, no, this is the right thing. I'm going to go. He says, there are tax collectors, there are prostitutes who respond to the truth in faith, and they will be saved before you. It's because there are self-righteous people, people who say, well, I'm good enough. And they don't see their need. They don't recognize the fact that they are a sinner before God, and they don't respond to him in faith because they think, well, I'm good enough. But then you have sinners who know they're sinners, who hear the truth and respond in faith. They believe and they repent from their sin and are saved. You see, there is evidence of God. Don't deny it. Rather, respond in faith. And this God, who we can see evidence of, is a God who loves you and me. Is a God who sent his Son to save us. Because all of us have a problem. We are all sinners. And our sin has cut us off from God and destined us for eternity of judgment. But God sent Jesus, his Son, to die in our place, to take the punishment that we deserved upon himself so that we could be forgiven and be saved. We can become children of God. So it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter what you have done. God gives grace to those who believe and respond in faith. And if you haven't yet, I would encourage you today to respond in faith and believe in Jesus as your Savior and trust him as your Savior. Well, now we come to the third event in our passage today. Israel is about to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. But notice what Joshua tells them to do first. In chapter 3, verse 5, they're ready to go, and Joshua says this. Verse 5, then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. He tells them to consecrate themselves. In other words, to go through the rituals that God has told them to go through to cleanse themselves before their holy God. But why do they need to be cleansed? Why do they need to be consecrated at this time? Well, Joshua gives us the reason. He says, because tomorrow, he says, God will do wonders among you. He tells them they need to be consecrated because God is going to do wonders among them. In other words, God is going to, they will be present there when God does something awesome. They will be present there and they will experience God's miraculous power in their midst. God is going to reveal himself in their midst through his power, through this miracle. And so they needed to be spiritually prepared for God to do this work amongst them. So the next day, Joshua tells the priests, you need to take the ark and carry it and walk into the river. Now, you need to know something about this river. The Jordan River at this time was in flood stage, meaning that every year when you get a lot of rains in the mountains, it would come down and the waters would overflow their banks. And so the water is moving fast. And if you've ever seen a fast-moving river, you don't really want to step into it. But it was moving fast. But he tells the priest, you take the ark of God and you go and you step into the waters of the Jordan. And as soon as they stepped into the waters stopped flowing. God caused it to stop. So this water that was overflowing its bank all of a sudden stopped. We're told it piled up far upstream. The water stopped flowing, and then the people were able to walk across the river on dry land. And then Joshua told the priests to come out, and when they came out, as soon as they stepped out of the riverbed, the water started flowing again. That was a miracle, right? Yeah, because water doesn't stop. Rivers don't just stop. There's no shut-off valve, all right? God performed a miracle there for them. And they were able to walk across on dry ground. But other than the fact that God just did this great miracle, there are a couple other things that make this very significant. The first one is that God used this miracle to confirm Joshua's leadership to the rest of Israel. Look at chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, today, he's talking about the miracle he's about to perform, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And then turn forward to chapter 4, verse 14. It says, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. So God used this miracle to confirm Joshua's leadership, to confirm to the people that God was with him, just like he was with Moses. Because you remember in chapter 1, verse 17, the people said, only may the Lord your God be with you just as he was with Moses. And God has just confirmed that he is. Because if you remember, and they use very similar miracles here. If you remember when Moses led the people out of Egypt, what did God do? He parted the Red Sea. And the people walked through on dry land. Here we have a very similar miracle. He stops the water of the Jordan. The people walk through on dry land. And God confirmed that Joshua was his choice of leader, and that Joshua was leading by following after God. God was clearly with Joshua and supporting Joshua. So God used this miracle to confirm his leadership, but God also used this miracle to confirm that he was with his people. And that he would do all that he had promised. Back in chapter 3, verse 10. Joshua is speaking to the people. And Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. He's saying, do you need proof? Do you need evidence that God is with you, that he is going to help you, that he's going to keep his promises, that he's able to drive out these people that he has said that he would drive out before you? Here you go. Watch what God does. And so God used this here to confirm that he was with his people, and that he would help his people, and that he would keep his promises. And again, it's just like the Red Sea. The people walked through the Red Sea. Now these people are walking through the Jordan. This is their Red Sea experience. And they can know for certain that God is giving them the land. Well, let's read a few more verses. Starting back in chapter 3, verse 17. It says, now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And all Israel was passing over on dry ground until the nation finished passing over the Jordan. So the priests went in, the water stopped, the people passed through. Chapter 4, verse 1. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man. So in other words, one man from each tribe. and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. So here we have this, Joshua tells them to go in and get stones, and they do. And these are large stones, because elsewhere it said that they need to put them on their shoulder. So, it's not like a little rock that you toss around, but it's a big stone you're going to carry on your shoulder. And so they're going to go into the river and pick up these stones from the middle of the river and take them out and take them to where they were lodging for the night. And Joshua is going to build a monument with those stones. However, before they do, Joshua does something else first. Look at verse 9 of chapter 4. Verse 9 says, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priest bearing the ark of the covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. So Joshua takes some stones and he sets them up in the middle of the river. And they were still there the day when this was written, when the book of Joshua was written. So people could see them and there was evidence there. So we have these two monuments of stones being set up, these two piles of stones. But what was the purpose? Why were they there? Well, they were there in order to help them to remember what God had done. And it gave them a way of teaching other people who hadn't been there and hadn't seen it. So it was there to remember and to help them teach. In fact, look at verse 19. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they had taken out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. He says, why do we do this? So that you may remember, and so everyone may know about God. So we have these large stones taken from within the river and set up outside the river. We have large stones taken and set up in the middle of the river. These are two monuments, two stone piles that are unnatural. They have obviously been set up, piled up, because rocks don't just climb up on each other. They've always been set up, and they are in unnatural places. Stones that should be in the middle of the river are out here, and these stones are in the middle of the river where no one could get in there to set up a rock pile. And so we have these two monuments that are reminders of what God has done. And they would stand out to anyone who saw them. And when they saw them, it would remind the people who were there what God had done for them. And others who would see it would ask, why are these here? Because you knew it didn't just happen naturally. Why are these here? And that gave you the opportunity to tell them what God had done. Whether you're talking about your children or just other people who just weren't there at the time. He says that all the world may know that the Lord is mighty. It is a testimony of God. It reminds the people of God who He is. That He is the Almighty who works on behalf of His people. And it reminds people everywhere to fear the Lord, to be faithful to Him, and to give Him the honor that He deserves. The thing is God established this idea of monuments and this idea of having activities to remind His people about Him and about all that He had done for them. In the Old Testament, they had stone piles, and they had the feasts, and they had many other things they did to remind themselves about God. In the New Testament, we have communion, which we celebrate, the Lord's Supper, where we take of the bread and the juice to remind us about Jesus' death, that he hung on the cross and shed His blood. And I think the greatest reminder we have in the New Testament times is the Holy Spirit, who bears witness to our spirit that we are the children of God. But God has given us these things to remind us of Himself. But we need to make sure that we do remember, that we take notice of all that God has done for us. And if we do that, if we remember what He has done for us and we take notice of what God has done for us, it will help us then to be faithful, to trust Him, and to bring Him the honor that He deserves. And if we have set up some way of remembering these things, it will help us to teach our kids about God and what He has done, to teach the next generation, teach other people who have not yet seen or known. And then it helps us to be faithful, to trust God, and to give Him the honor that He deserves. Now, I brought something with me this morning, and I don't always bring up object lessons, but I've got one this morning. This is my box. And some of you who have been to our house may recognize this box. It hangs on our wall. And this box is filled with things that remind us things that God has done. Some of them are answers to prayer, some of them may be miraculous, and some of them are just ordinary things, but they're things that God did for us, and it reminds us of the goodness and the greatness of God. Let me share a few of them with you. Most of you probably don't know what this is, if you can see it. This is a key for working on payphones. This is a reminder of a job I had. When I went to seminary, Julie and I were moving down to Texas, and we had a weekend. We went down to Texas for a weekend, and I needed a job and a place to live. And we were going to go to seminary, and we needed a place to live and a job. And so I had lined up an interview right before we went down. We went down for a couple days, and we came home with a job, working on payphones, and a place to live. God is good. Here I have another. This also represents a job. This is a clip of finish nails for a finish nail gun. And this is a great story. While I was in seminary, the payphone company had been sold, and so I was without a job. But anyways, while I was in the seminary, there was a time when I had found another job. I was working for a guy doing some remodeling, some carpentry. But I went to school 2 days a week, and I needed to work the other 4 days of the week to survive. And the guy I was working for kind of ran out of work quite often. And so there were many days when I was off work, I was off school, and I had no work. And so we started praying for a new job or for more work, one way or the other. Julie went to a Bible study that she had with some of the wives of seminary students and said, Adam needs a job or more work. And so she shared that prayer request. Then one of the ladies in her group, who happened to be Julie's best friend, went to her small group at her church just the following week. And there was a man in that group who did remodeling, who gave a prayer request. I need someone to work for me. And the next day I was working for him, my friend Paul. And we worked together for several years. Loved working for him. Great job. God provided just what we needed, just when we needed it. This reminds us of the birth of our son Michael. And this here reminds us of his second birth, when he came to believe in Jesus as his Savior, when Julie used this wordless book to explain the gospel to him, and one night he took it and he explained it to her and said, I want to do that. We also have one that reminds us of Joanna's birth and of Joanna's salvation. We have a pin here that says First Baptist Church of Oceanside on it. There are lots of things. One other thing I will point out. This is so simple. But these are tickets to a basketball game between the Dallas Mavericks and the Los Angeles Lakers. And this was back when the Lakers were good. When we were in seminary, I didn't have extra money. We just barely made it and stuff. But somebody gave the seminary 100 tickets to this basketball game, and so they donated the tickets, and anyone who signed up got to go. So we signed up, and the three of us, Joanna wasn't born yet, but Julie and Michael and I went to the basketball game, and we got to see Kobe and Shaq, and it was a great time. Now, from where we were sitting, there was no one behind us, and we could reach back and touch the wall. But we didn't care. God had provided something that, we didn't need it, But it was a great thing that we got to do, and just a great thing that God did for us. But we have this, and it hangs on our wall, and it's just a reminder of all the things that God has done. Some, like I said, some of them are miraculous, and some of them are just great memories that God has done for us. And I just want to encourage you guys to remember what God has done for you. Remember who He is and what He has done. I began this morning by asking with the question, how many stories have started with the words, remember when? And I'm going to suggest this morning that we need to have more stories that start with, remember when God. Remember when God. I mean, we can tell the stories, remember when we drove, remember when we lost that, remember when I fell. But let's tell more stories that start with, remember when God. Because it's not that those stories don't exist. It's not that those things haven't happened. It's just that sometimes we just don't always tell them. Or we may not even think about them. We may not remember them. So do what you need to do to remember what God has done. To remember His faithfulness, to remember His help in your life, to remember His grace that He has shown to you. Do what you need to do to remember what He has done. So then you can honor God. And so you can tell others about His greatness.